Okay. Oh, is this? This is it? All right. So welcome here, everybody. This is our, this is our third Sundays with the Saint, actually, this year. So welcome. And for any first-timers, or no? I don't know. First for this. Well, yeah, that counts. That's great. Well, welcome to the Taylor clan. We are excited to be here tonight, and tonight we're going to be looking at the story of Amy Carmichael. And I don't know if you guys have been paying attention to the thought of the day. I really like the book. It's actually an excellent read. That wrote this biography of Amy Carmichael, and she says in it, "To Amy Carmichael, I owe what C.S. Lewis said he owed George MacDonald, as great a debt as one can owe another. I cannot pay it." And she goes on in the preface to talk about when she was in boarding school in Florida as like a 13, 14-year-old girl, her headmistress said, "Hey, have you heard about Amy Carmichael?" Handed her a few books, and those books just changed her life. And that's our hope tonight. If you were here last time, if you were actually watching from home and you were watching Pastor Don eat the ice cream, you might have assumed that this was all about the ice cream. And I know Pastor Andrew said today is National Ice Cream Day. I don't know if it's National Eating Ice Cream Day or just National Being Close to Ice Cream. But it's not about the ice cream, and it's not about just giving us another excuse to get together, as good as that is. But our hope tonight is we would be inspired by her life, that we would be inspired to pursue God more like her, to take more risk, and to surrender our lives for his glory. That is our hope with these books. She does talk about that later on in the preface. She talks about, I'm going to have to find it here. The Christian life comes down to two simple things: trust and obedience. What does that mean exactly? We could hold a seminar and talk about it. Visual aids are better. Look at a life. And then she talks about Amy Carmichael and her inspiration. We are here to be inspired. We watched as a family the movie Molly. Actually, it's not a movie, it's a documentary a few months ago. And somebody said at the end of that is what I want my life to be like. And if you want to see the movie, I've got a copy of that. It's worth watching. We are wanting to be inspired tonight. We're wanting to help us understand what does it mean to live for God. And then we are also, our mission committee meets probably once every 6 weeks or so on average. And one of the things we are praying for is we are praying that this church would send more young missionaries. We have Kelly Robinson heading out tomorrow back to the Czech Republic. But we are praying that God would raise up even more. And one of the things I love about this church as I look around is I have seen some amazing young people. When I say young people, I don't just mean the older teens, but I mean the younger teens and even those who are not even in their teen years. We have some amazing kids. And one of the things I'm most excited, I'm getting older. I get my Shoppers Drug Mart discount in about 14, 15 months. But one of the things I'm most excited about Linda. One of the things I'm most excited about is watching what God is going to do in the lives of some of our younger kids and where God is going to call them and what God is going to do through them. And I think we have some amazing stories to look forward to. So why don't we pray at this point and ask God to bless our time together. Lord, we're grateful tonight to be able to gather. We are grateful as well tonight to be able to talk about one of a great servant of yours. I don't think she would use those words to describe herself. But we want to thank you for her example and her courage and what you've done through her life, how you glorified your name through her. And our prayer tonight is, Lord, that you would light our hearts up, that you would challenge us, that you would change us, that you would encourage us, and that our lives would echo more of the things that we see in hers, that courage, that risk-taking, that surrender to you. And we just pray as a church, Lord, as we just mentioned, a mission committee praying for missionaries to be pulled out of this church. Lord, we are praying that again tonight, that you would call out from this church young men and women that would serve you all over the world. And we pray this for the glory of your great name. Amen. So Amy Carmichael, we're kind of juggling the slides. You can go to the next slide. I can't even see who's up there because I don't have my glasses on, but if I have my glasses on, I can't see here. But Amy Carmichael, that's a nice picture of her. There's not a lot of pictures of Amy Carmichael. She was not one that enjoyed having her picture taken. In this picture, she looks like a nice young woman. She was, of course, a child at one point, and she was also the eldest of 7 kids. So before she became a great missionary, she was an older sister. Has anybody here grown up with an older sister in your house? And I don't want you to share any stories, but is it hard? Is it brutal sometimes? Amy Carmichael was a little bit like that, and I'm going to tell a story about an older sister I knew, actually, that you probably know, that's probably sitting in the gym and probably wishing I would stop. My wife, Ruth, was an older sister, and she was a little bit in that spirit of Amy Carmichael in terms of how she dealt with her siblings. And one of the things she did, I don't know how often she did it, but it doesn't really matter, it's a great story, is she was going to train Pastor Don to become a missionary one day. And it was a very simple training, but kind of brutal at the same time. She would put his head in the couch under the cushion, then she'd put the cushion on top of his head, and then she would jump on his head. And I don't know how long this lasted, but long enough that Don is a pastor of a church here in Canada and has yet to go to the mission field. I don't know if he passed the test. I don't know what happened there. But Amy Carmichael was a little bit like that. Her favorite color is blue, and if you know anything of the story, you might remember her praying as a young child, "Lord, make my brown eyes blue." And she would pray that a lot of nights, and then she would look in the morning and find that her eyes were still brown. But one of her little brothers had blue eyes, and one of the things she'd like to do was to take her little brother's cheeks in her fingers, and she would squeeze them, because what she found is if you squeeze hard enough, the blue eyes look even more vivid with tears in them. So I don't know if you want to try that. Grab somebody's cheeks in your bubble and give them a good squeeze and see if the color is prettier with tears. But that's one of the things she did. Another story about her younger years is she was told by one of their governesses that the seeds of the laburnum tree were poisonous. So what she said to her brothers, well, let's see how many we can eat before we die. And she got her brothers eating these seeds. And it wasn't too long before they were feeling pretty sick, and they were given some sort of a product to help them get rid of the product in their stomachs. They were sent to bed without eating supper, for which they were grateful because they were in no condition to eat supper. And she said to herself that night, her mother gave her a pretty good talking to. She said, I deserved it, I'm the eldest. Still, if she only knew how much naughtier I could be, she wouldn't think I'm naughty at all. They went through a lot of governesses. One time the kids went down, they got rid of this English woman very quickly. And her dad said, why did you guys go down with the governess to see her off? And Amy said, we just wanted to be sure she went. Another time, she was told that eating plum seeds will make the plum trees grow out of your head. And so she did the math, and she decided, I probably need about 12 trees, so she ate 12 seeds, hoping that she could grow the plum tree. So she was pretty spirited. One last story I wanted to mention is, on the next picture, you can see their house in Mill Isle. Actually, no, you can't. That's the older sister. Sorry, we're juggling here, because that's their house. One time she went into the washroom with her little brothers, those 2 little brothers, and pushed them through the skylight. They slid down the slate roof and into the lead gutters, and they were enjoying the beautiful view of the seaside until her dad saw her, and he came in quickly, got them off the roof. So she was quite an interesting older sister, to be sure, and some of that strength of character we'll see coming out and being necessary in her missionary career. She was also one who loved nature. She had a dollhouse that had all the beautiful furniture and dolls, and she took out the furniture and filled that house with moss and stone and beetles and earwigs, and she just loved that. And then she also loved riding her pony on the beach near her home, and that's something that she continued to love throughout her life. So she had a pretty happy childhood. If you look at that house, you go like, yeah, that's a pretty nice-looking house. Her dad was actually a owner of a mill and was doing very well, and at one point, she just had a beautiful childhood, but it got difficult in 1879 when she was sent away to boarding school. It was time for her to have more education, so they sent her away. And that was really difficult. She was only 12 years old, and it took some time to adjust. But she began to feel fairly comfortable there, made some friends, and it was all right. And on the next slide, I'm going to see if you can guess what is common. That's the boarding school she went to. Now you see a toe, and you see some strings, and you see a comet in the sky. Anybody know the story of this one? Probably not. Anyhow, there was supposed to be a passing of a comet, and all her friends said to her, Amy, you need to go talk to the headmistress and see if we can stay up at night to see this amazing thing. And Amy, of course, went to the headmistress, and the headmistress said, no, you can't see that. But Amy was not deterred. She decided what she would do. All the girls wanted to see the comet. She would tie a string to everybody's toes, and she would stay awake till much, much later that night, and then she would pull on the strings, and everybody would wake up. So they did that. They were successful in that part of the idea. They all went up to the attic to see this amazing comet, and in the attic they found the headmistress and all the teachers, so that didn't go very, very well. They didn't do a big investigation. They knew who the ringleader was. It was Amy. She was punished, but not expelled. But one other thing that was really important in her life, she grew up, her family was a strong Christian family, loved the Lord. They talked about the Lord all the time. But it wasn't until she was 15 at Harrogate that she came to understand that she had to give her life to Jesus. They were at a special meeting, and they sang her mother's favorite hymn and her favorite hymn, which was Jesus Loves Me. And in that song, God just spoke to her heart and just changed her. She wrote home to her parents about what had happened to her, and that was a big, big thing in her life. Later that same year, she had a letter from her family, and at home things were changing. The big news was no more boarding school. She was very excited about that because she was looking forward to going home. The only problem was the reason that there was no more boarding school was because her dad they were having financial difficulties. There was some more competition, and so they moved to Belfast to open a smaller mill. And it was difficult. It was a difficult time for the family because her dad sometime later got sick, contracted double pneumonia. And they prayed for him and were hoping for healing, but his condition deteriorated. And so when she was 18 years old, her father had passed away, which is obviously a very difficult time. And it created a lot of other complications that made it hard as well. As far as we know, there's nothing in her writings that indicated that this created a huge crisis of faith for Amy, nor did it for her mom. There's not a lot about her mom in the book, but there are hints that point to her as being a very amazing lady. We know that her mom found strength in the Lord in her Bible, beside Nahum 1:7, where it says, "The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him." Her mom wrote these words, found true all along the line ever since. So her mom was quite strong. And as Amy dealt with that family situation, she stepped up. She didn't have a crisis of faith. Instead, she became like a second mother to her siblings. And over time, the family found their way living in a very different circumstance in Belfast, far from the family home on the coast. In Belfast, there was a lot of observable poverty. And one day as they were coming home from church on a cold, damp day, there was something that happened in Amy's life that really changed things for her. Her and her two younger brothers, Norman and Ernest, were walking home from church, and they noticed an older woman who was struggling with a heavy bundle, and she was poorly dressed for the weather. And Amy noticed, like, come on, guys, she needs help. They went over to help her and her brothers, and they helped her all the way home. And it was a hard thing to do. It sounds kind of noble, and you think people would be looking on with approval, but people that knew her looked on in dismay, with disapproval. She felt very ashamed at the time, but they pushed through and persevered in helping this old lady. And as she was passing a fountain, this verse came to mind. Depending on the book you read, it comes across in different ways. Some people say it came through a thought. Others would claim that she heard a voice. It doesn't matter. This verse was pressed into her heart in that moment as she passed that fountain. In 1 Corinthians 3, gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. That hit her hard, and from that point, she determined to live a life where there would be things that would last from it. She had a growing concern for the poor in Belfast, and she made connection with a Dr. Montgomery who was running a mission in the city. And I don't know how this all came about, but Amy saw a lot of things and went to a lot of places. Dr. Montgomery said of Amy that she went to places, walked some streets that she wouldn't let his daughter walk. But she talked about her concern for the young girls. They called them shawlies. They were girls who would work in the factories, young women, teens. They would work typically between 14 and 16-hour days for hardly any pay and in poor conditions. And so they didn't have the money to buy the hats. And so they would have these shawls that they would throw over them, and they would keep them hopefully mostly warm. And she had a desire to help them out. And so she began initially teaching Sunday school to boys with this man's daughter. And then eventually she started to work in her own church. She got permission from the minister. Her mom supported the idea, and they started working with the Shawleys. It was interesting work. It was difficult work. And some of the struggles she had was that they had their own financial troubles as well. When her father passed away, money was a lot tighter. And the story goes as well that their father had lent a lot of money to somebody that he was expecting to be paid back, and that person did not pay them back. And so there was a time in their life where they were really having to be careful how they spent. So it was a difficult time, but the ministry with the Shawleys grew. The only issue was other people in their church started noticing there was more and more of these young girls, and they were kind of loud, and they didn't kind of pray like they prayed, and they didn't talk quietly like they talked quietly. And there began to be a bit of a problem in a church where the people are saying, you know what, there is not enough room for all these girls in this church. And one of the things I find most amazing about Amy Carmichael is that that's a pretty discouraging thing to hear. I don't know if you've ever been involved in a ministry where it's going really well, but maybe, they leave holes in the church walls and people are going, you can't have this. And yet you're seeing God work in their lives, and then you see the attitude of some people in the church toward that, and it's discouraging. That didn't deter Amy. She talked to the pastor who supported her, but they still had to find another place to go. So her solution was simple: I'll build a new hall. And her brother said, well, Amy, how do you do that? They didn't have lots of money themselves personally. That's expensive proposition. And she said to her brother, it's God's work, it can be done. And she had the habit of writing things down in what she called her Ask and Receive book. I looked to see if I could find a picture of it. I couldn't find it anywhere. But a book where she would write down a prayer request, and she would pray for that thing, and then when God answered, she'd write it down. Now we know she did never get an answer of yes for changing her eyes to blue. But there was a lot of other examples where she prayed and God responded. And so she began to pray. And she saw in a newspaper that you could build an iron hall for 500 pounds, which was a lot of money. She said, great, that's exactly what I need. And she began to pray for that. And eventually she was put in touch with a woman who had lost a sister recently, a wealthy woman who invited her to lunch. Wealthy enough, she had a butler. And this young girl sat with his wealthy woman and said, here's my vision, here's my dream, this is what we're doing. And a couple days later, Amy got a letter from the lady saying, I'll support it. And she said, I'll send you a check for 500 pounds. Now, the only issue is you have to put a building on a piece of dirt. And she didn't have any dirt, but somebody suggested talk to a mill owner. Maybe they'll donate land, which she did. And God answered prayer, and very quickly she had this hall erected on land that was, I think it was rented from one of the mill owners. And in January of 1889, the hall was ready. She was just 21 years old. That is pretty amazing, isn't it? That kind of faith, that young. She called the hall the Welcome, and on the front of the hall these words, that in all things he might have the preeminence. And she wrote an invitation to these Shawley girls and said, come one, come all to the Welcome Hall, something like that. It wasn't incredibly amazing poetry, but she told them to come in their work clothes, and God worked among those girls. Many responded to God, and it was just an amazing ministry. What's interesting is that Amy quickly left that ministry. Within just over a year, she was led out of the ministry. And the person who took over the work was Miss Mitchell, the woman who gave her that initial gift to pay for the iron hall. The woman who had a butler at home, the woman who had this beautiful place to live, began her ministry with the Shawleys. So that was kind of neat. Now, one other major influence, in addition to her upbringing, in addition to the work of God in her life, bringing her to faith, and then those kind of unique moments where she was helping that older woman and God just really impressed on her heart this need to live a life well lived. Another major influence in her life was the Keswick Convention. And you may or may not have heard of that. She was invited to attend an event in Glasgow, Scotland in the fall of 1886. And this was in the Keswick style. And she went to the meetings full of hope that God would speak to her. And And it was only in the closing prayer that God really impressed some words in her heart. The words, "Oh Lord, we know that you are able to keep us from falling." And those words just encouraged her similarly. And then a year later, another convention of the sort held in Belfast, where she met Mr. Robert Wilson, a person who was going to become like a second father to her. She was there, and she heard somebody speak named James Taylor, or not James Taylor. He would have sung, I think, and it would have been really beautiful. It was Hudson Taylor who spoke at that meeting, and God lit a fire in her heart. And it's kind of interesting when you read her story and realize here was a woman who was greatly encouraged by the missionary stories of those before her. In fact, in the video, well, we won't see the whole video, but she still has a library that's kept in the room where she finished her days. And in that library are a number of missionary biographies that she found super encouraging. So she was encouraged by the missionaries before us, encouraged by those living in her time who spoke, and then wrote words that encouraged Elizabeth Elliot, who and her husband and that whole group inspired a whole other brand new missionary movement. So it's interesting, but the Keswick Convention was something where God really worked through her. After that meeting, her and her mom were invited to become the leaders of invited by the leader of a Manchester City mission to come and work with them. And her mom actually took over a rescue home, and Amy moved there to work with the poor in the slums. And so this is when she left the ministry of the Shawleys and moved to this area. And it's great to see that she was afraid. She was afraid, but the words of Jeremiah 1:7 gripped her heart, and in her Bible she wrote these words, "First launch into the deep." This was a big change for her. She was frightened. She didn't know what she was going to be getting into, but God encouraged her and she pushed through. So she moved into a very difficult and poor area. Her sister talks about visiting her place there, and that about tin walls between the dwellings, and bugs would kind of crawl through. And I don't know what kind of bugs there were. I mean, she did love nature, so she didn't seem to be too intimidated by that. But it was a tough place to work. She worked with the factory girls in the city, and just a very rough place. I think sometimes we look back and think it couldn't be as bad as our world today. Well, this was an industrial town on the sea. So it was a pretty sketchy area at times. People sold their bodies sometimes to survive. Walking through the streets was sketchy. At one time she was walking, I don't know where she was walking to, whether she was walking home, but gradually a group of guys surrounded her, and eventually there was a mob, and it was not looking good. And then as she was walking, a woman rushed out of a home, grabbed her, pulled her out of the mob, and pulled Amy into her home. So God had his hand on her and protected her, but she was in some hard areas as a very young woman. So again, speaks a little bit of her courage. And she wrote these words, "If the ultimate, the hardest cannot be asked of me, if my fellow hesitate to ask it and turn to someone else, then I know nothing of Calgary's love." There's a lot of interesting things she said. But during this time, she became good friends with Mr. Wilson, who owned coal mines in Cumberland, was a fairly wealthy man, was a co-founder of the Keswick Deeper Life Conventions in England. And he was just a real gift of God to her as she was to him. She had lost her father and he had lost a daughter, and she was encouraged and mentored something by him as a spiritual father. And eventually she moved into his 11-bedroom home, and her job was to help out with all the work and tasks that he had. And it would allow her to regain her health because she had some health issues that we're going to talk about a little bit. And again, in 1888, she had the opportunity to attend the convention in Keswick. And it was an unforgettable time. It was life-changing again, and her interest in missions was fueled here. And she started to lean towards that direction. It was a little bit later, in January 13, 1892, God spoke to her in a very clear and powerful way. She wrote in the margin of her Bible, Broughton, January 92, by the verse Acts 8:54. And the thought was exciting, and also the thought terrified her. And I'll see if I can get through some of this letter. As she considers this call that she heard so clearly, she considers and counts the cost, and writes to her mom to ask her in a long way, "What do you think?" She begins the letter, "My precious mother, Have you given your child unreservedly to the Lord for whatever he wills? Oh, may he strengthen you to say yes to him if he asks something which costs. Darling mother, for a long time, as you know, the thoughts of those die in the dark, 50,000 of them every day, while we at home live in the midst of blazing light. This thought has been very present to me, and the longing to go to them and tell of Jesus has been strong upon me. Interestingly, at one point, she prayed for God to take away this burden for the people. She's talking about the 50,000 who are dying in the darkness. Every bit of the pleasure or work which has come to me has had underlying in the thought of those people who have never heard of Jesus. Before my eyes, clearer than any love of you, has been the constant picture of those millions who have no chance and never had one of hearing the love which makes our lives so bright. And then, you would hear the story of a girl that would pester her brothers or climb a roof or challenge a governess and think, here's a woman who is looking for adventure. But you hear her weighing some of the costs here. But home claims seem to say stay, and I thought it was his will. It was perhaps till yesterday. I can't explain it, but lately the need seems to have come closer, and I wrote it down a few days ago just to have it in black and white, why I'm not going. And their first reason, your need of me, my mother. Secondly, the great loneliness it would mean to my dear second father. Thirdly, the thought that by staying I might make it easier for others to go if he called. And then fourthly, my not being strong. But in his sight of these four things we're staying from those poor heathen for. And he goes on to talk about it and then saying, I've never heard it so plainly before. I cannot be mistaken. For I know he spoke. He said, go. I cannot stay, mother. I feel as I've been stabbing someone I loved. And then it goes on and on. Very interesting to hear. I wish we had time for the whole letter. And then you get a bit of a sense of her mom in her response. It's interesting in the story later as she's serving in India, there is a young woman who desperately wants to go to work with her in the compound where she's working. Her fiance goes ahead of her. Her dad says, you cannot go. You have to stay for 3 more years home to confirm that you really are called to India and to confirm that this is really the man you are to marry. This parent held his daughter back just to make sure she was sure. Not Amy's mom. She says these words, yes, dearest Amy, he has lent me to me all these years. He only knows what a strength, comfort, and the joy you have been to me. In sorrow, he made you my staff and solace. In loneliness, my more than child companion. And in gladness, my bright and merry-hearted sympathizer. So, darling, when he asks you to go now, to go away from within my reach, can I say nay? No, Amy, he is yours and you are his, to take you where he pleases and to use you as he pleases. I can trust you to him, and I do. And I thank him for letting you hear his voice as you have done. Anyhow, it's something worth reading. Give a sense of her mom and her family and the kind of scenario was. So it was not an easy thing to consider. And it wasn't a one-time thing. Again, I would have assumed there was a sense of adventure to her, which there is to be sure. But this cost of being away from family weighed on her all her life. Later on, this gentleman, that Mr. Wilson, she called him the dear old man, the Dom, asked her to come back and visit in England and sent him all the costs for her passage. And again, she prayed. She wanted desperately to see him. But she said, again, God held me fast and kept me there. And it also talks about, one would have assumed, as we prayed earlier, Lord, it would be wonderful if we saw kids and young people from this church go out on career mission. And we would celebrate that. In Amy's case, it wasn't always celebration. She writes these words about people and their opinion and their advice. She says, when I had to make the final decision to go abroad, I was torn in two. Many were saying that it was wrong of me to dream of leaving home, for there was one who wanted me, and it seemed needed me, this dear old man. His friends, leaders of the convention, were utterly opposed to my leaving him. So you can imagine this place where God has spoken so clearly, these leaders of the Keswick Convention, where God has worked so powerfully in her heart, saying to Amy, I think you've made a mistake. I think you need to stay here. Some even told me that if I left, his death would be at my door. Because those things who said these things were the very saints of the earth, their words had weight. On the one side, there were many voices, and on the other side, one compelling voice. And she talks about a time when she was working through getting interviewed by the mission. There was a woman who cared for the people in the evening, Miss Solitude, and she asked this lady outright, am I crazy? Am I right to go? And the woman just listened carefully, waited a long time to answer, said, yes, you need to go. So she worked through a lot in this call, and I think it's just important for us to understand sometimes we think of call as a very simple thing. As Amy heard the very clear call to go, at the same time she saw the very real cost in her life and struggled with that. The other thing she talked about before too is that of her health. She had a condition called neuralgia, and that's, I'm not a doctor, but it is not a helpful thing. And in fact, when she first applied, she wanted to go to China, and the doctor for China Inland Mission said, you can't go. She declared her unfit for reasons of health. And so it was decided that she'd be sent to Japan to work in a ministry led by Barclay Buxton. So at 26 years of age, she jumped on a ship, 1893, 26-year-old single woman. And I don't know what you think about travel. I've been on a ship. I was on a ship this last March. I think it was pretty nice. Not the same kind of ship. During the journey, she led the Japanese captain to faith, but her arrival was not amazing. She landed in Japan during a typhoon. Because of the storm, the ship wasn't able to get into port, and so somehow they transferred the passengers from the ship during a storm onto a steam tug, and she and a bunch of Japanese folk got on that little tug, and they kind of bounced into the landing place. Everybody seasick, and she got off, got her possessions on the side, on dry, well, not dry land because it was raining so hard, and looked around for a white face, of which there was none. And stood there and realized, there's nobody here to meet me, and laughed. And then Lord led her to get to where she needed to go, but very, very difficult arrival. Amy struggled with the language. I think actually Aaron might be in the gym. Talked about the weird formulations in the Japanese language. I don't know if that's still today or whether that's sort of an older form of Japanese. But while working there, she realized she would dress kind of how she normally dressed in Britain. She was witnessing to a Japanese woman through a translator, and things were going amazing. She saw God working and leading in the conversation, and then this Japanese woman looked down at her hands and saw these British fur gloves on her hands, and was going, ooh, and the conversation totally changed to fur gloves instead of Jesus. And that was the moment where she said, okay, enough of this Western style dress. I'm not going to let this be a distraction as I'm working with people. And that was a little bit countercultural in the missions world that created tension with other missionaries. But again, you see here a young woman, she's fresh off the boat, literally, and she says, you know what? She had the tenacity and the spine to push into that, even though other people were discouraging in that way. She struggled in Japan with debilitating headaches, and that was part of her condition and part of just the difficult climate she was in. Even so, she had fruitful work there. And there's a story when she was heading to a Buddhist village one time, she asked the Lord what she should pray for, and she had the impression that she should pray for one soul to come to Christ. And so she did that. Then another time 2, and then another time 4, and then finally 8. And again, criticized for being presumptuous. And I know the work there was difficult. And I imagine those veteran missionaries are saying, you don't know what it's like here. You don't know how hard it is. But God, every time they prayed those prayers, God answered to the exact number that was impressed on her heart. And they saw more people saved in a few weeks than they had in the previous year. But as I mentioned, she was struggling with her health. So 15 months after having arrived in Japan, she had a condition called Japanese head. I think it's probably got a new, better name now. That sounds a little bit more dignified. But it just splitting headaches and pain. So she was sent back to England to regroup. And while in England, that is when she was interviewed and accepted to go to India by the church. And in 1895, on October 11th, she left Britain again, not knowing that she was never going to be returning. And she arrived in November of 1895, the hope that she would arrive in great health, but she arrived and started with dengue fever, which was bad pain in the legs, a bad headache. They call it breakbone fever as well. But she did recover from that, and she began her ministry in India. And if the ministry was difficult in one way in Japan, it was difficult in a different way here because people were very opposed to the Christian mission. To convert to Christianity from Hinduism was shameful. Some family members would be shunned or beaten, and in some cases even killed. So it was a very, very hard place to work. She was asked at one point by Missionary Society to write about her experience as a missionary in India. And I don't know if you've ever read prayer letters. Some people are really good at writing prayer letters and making it sound like things are amazing. That was not Amy. Amy said, I'm going to give you an interesting, unromantic truth. And so she wrote this incredible manuscript, and the Mission Society back home read it and said, this is really discouraging. And so they said, no, thank you, we'll send it back, not interested. But later, friends of her that were familiar with it took the manuscript later and found a publisher. But years later, she learned that committee, Christians, wanted to send her back home after reading this stuff because they just found it's just so discouraging because it just sounded so hard and so difficult and so backward. But Amy was very truthful in her reporting. She was quite an interesting person. She was a very practical person, but she was a risk taker. She wasn't afraid of new challenges. She wasn't afraid to go it on her own. In India, she earned the nickname, the woman who runs like a hare. And it talks about her just walking very, very quickly everywhere she went. And then she'd always be looking at her watch, trying to redeem the time. While the Indian people she worked with would kind of shuffle along, and she would tease them like, you guys all walk like elephants. Like, don't you have anywhere to go? And they're all laughing at her like she's just flying around. She would just race. She still loved racing her ponies. The story tells her of her one time riding a pony rather than sort of the bandies that they had, and running so fast, galloping with her pony and actually bumping into a guy and knocking him down. And she just kept going. She liked to move. In her work in India, she had a little tricycle apparently that she would just kind of zip around from place to place on this big property where she was working. She was able, I mentioned, she had a perseverance. She could be hit with opposition and difficulty, but it wouldn't throw her off track. And she learned to lean on God for guidance. So I'm not saying that she never got discouraged, because if you read closely, you'll see it. But she never got stopped, and she never gave up. She was said to be bright and personable and charming and tenacious and courageous. And she also said in talking of herself, she said, I'm not a pacifist. She seemed to enjoy a good challenge. In her witnessing work, she talked to one man who said of his wife, talking about if she ever comes to Christ, she'll burn to ashes first. She may go out dead if she likes, but she'll never go out living. And if I rang on a doorbell and heard that report, I'd probably kind of go, oh, well, just kind of, you'd shuffle away, you'd be a little discouraged. She was witnessing to a woman from a very high caste in India whose name was Gold. And this is what she wrote after having had that opportunity and seeing the Lord just kind of pulling at this woman's heart. Will gold come out? If so, we shall be in the very thick of the fight again. And she talks about the thick of the fight being a bunch of angry men coming and surrounding their bungalow and yelling at them and threatening to come in and beat everybody up. So she knows what to expect should this woman respond. And she says, after writing those words, we'll be in the very thick of the fight again, she says, hallelujah. Will God move in Beautiful's heart so she will dare her husband's fury and the knife he flashed before her eyes? If so, our bungalow will be in the very teeth of the storm, angry men all around it, and we kept inside by the power of God. It's like, oh, I would have tried to find somebody a little bit more open to the gospel, but she wasn't put off by difficulty. And it was hard work, struggling to get a hearing. Some places they were chased out of town. Some places they had things thrown at them. And also the responsibility when people did respond, the cost that they were paid, where they're kicked out from their families, homes were burned. But she persevered along with those who worked with her. And she was known to kind of push into places where other missionaries wouldn't. In fact, she would dye her skin with coffee sometimes to gain access to places that foreigners couldn't get into because of their white skin. So she was quite a gal in that respect, and when she was in disguise, she was very thankful for her brown eyes because it helped her to blend in. She wasn't deterred by much. There's a great story. One thing that was really important to her is that every child learned how to swim, and one day she was teaching a child to swim in the forest pool, and a child somehow got a hold of her and dragged her under, and she was drowning. And she said of it, "Never mind, the sensation of drowning was lovely. No need to alarm the family back and down of her by talking about it." She just lifted everybody up, and also courageous, even in criticism. We talked about how other missionaries frowned upon the way she adapted with local dress. She talks about a time when 7 of her girls were baptized, and she learned that in that context, when people stood up in baptism, there was often a spiritual attack, an enemy attack after that happened. After those girls were baptized, she was exhausted to the point of breakdown. Her mission said, "You need to come home." And she argued with them, and she won the argument apparently. She argued, "India is home. I am here." And so she stayed. And around that time, the nursery was hit by a nasty dysentery, and 10 of the babies died. One of her workers left under the cloud of serious suspicion of wrongdoing. She doesn't name the issue, but she writes down that it was worse than illness and death. And just massive criticism. In fact, there was a movement among some missionaries and Indian Christians in India. They had a Get Amy Out of India kind of club. So she pushed through some very difficult things. I think a lot of us struggle with criticism, and it did crush her, and it was difficult, but it didn't stop her. Some people said of her work with saving kids that it was a stunt, that she was trying to draw attention to herself. Other people said that she was a dictator, that the girls that she rescued actually worshipped her. And there's a neat little poem in this book that she writes. She has a lot of, grateful that she wrote as much as she did. Speaking of the difficulty, she writes these words, O thou who art my quietness, my deep repose, my rest from strife of tongues, my holy hill, fair is thy pavilion where I hold me still. Back let them fall from me, my clamorous foes, confusion multiplied. From crowding of things I sense, I flee, and in thee hide. Until this tyranny be overpassed, thy hand will hold me fast. What though the tumult of the storm increase, grant to thy servant strength, O Lord, and bless with peace. So she fought through some very difficult things. The other thing, I can only imagine what it's like to live in a compound with 130 little girls, some in nursery, some in diapers. She wrote to somebody that she probably trimmed thousands and thousands of little fingernails throughout her work. You can imagine the workload, dealing with the needs of so many kids, dealing with the heartache of losing so many children, dealing with the day in, day out demands of feeding all these people. She fought hard. One thing she did have, she found strength in a number of areas. One of the things she prayed for, she prayed, Lord, give me soldiers, give me comrade in arms, people who will walk with me, people who will share the discipline of life, people who would pay the price and forsake all and live a life without fences. Then she had several young Indian women who shared that sort of spirit. And at one point, I don't know how long this lasted, but they had for lack of a better term, they had a group called the Sisters of the Common Life, and they took on a number of vows, and they just shared life together, spurred each other on, and pushed each other to greater commitment to Jesus. So she leaned on friends. The other thing she certainly leaned on was God and his word. She writes in one difficult moment, there have been times of late when I've had to hold on to one text with all my might. And then she writes of how God's word has encouraged her. So she knew how to encourage herself, as we heard this morning in Melissa's story. David strengthened himself in the Lord. Amy knew how to do that. She also knew how to do that with her friends, and she was quite a gal. The other issue that she did fight through was a lot of legal issues. Her work was complicated, and when kids would come to her, there was always a threat. She was actually called by some accused of kidnapping children, and she had some legal issues with that. And again, in one case, the case was before the courts for almost 13 years. She, in one of the court cases, she was told that she would have to return a child to her mother, pay all legal costs, and she faced the prospect of prison. And again, she just testified how God carried her through those moments, that at the moment of the verdict, she had a strange and powerful experience of the presence of God and the sense of his peace. So she was somebody who worked through a lot of things, who persevered through a lot of difficulty, and the Lord was good to her and carried her through that. Probably in India, the biggest thing that happened, there's a lot of great stories. I would just encourage you, get a hold of the biographies. I believe actually there's the library downstairs is open. I don't know how that all works. I know Sarah works at the public library, and it's confusing and complicated to get books out. Not so much here. You just go down, open the door, and push in and grab the book you want, and then bring it back when you're done. But there's a lot of great stories there. But probably the biggest story of her when she was in India was a story of, as they were traveling with a group they called the Starry Cluster, or the band, a group of women who would go around witnessing, traveling together. In 1901, something happened. As they were traveling, they would see occasionally opportunities where there'd be some sort of a special worship thing, where there'd be a large procession, and she would see these young kids and wondered, what is this story? And as gradually time went on, there was sort of rumor and concern. It wasn't exactly easy to confirm everything, but there were these kids in these temples who were working. And she began to pray at that. In March of 1901, something happened. There was a little girl called Prina, or Pearl Eyes. Her story is that at one point she was given to the local temple. It was part of an ancient practice in India. She would be given because of some sort of a vow, or because of poverty, or maybe if a woman lost her husband, she would give a daughter to the temple because of whatever sin that caused the death of the husband. And the child was called a Devadasi, and her job was to care for the temple, perform rituals, ceremonial rituals. But essentially, she was a slave, and there was also a sexual part of that was incredibly disturbing. Amy didn't know about all the details until as she worked further and more with these young girls. But a little girl named Prina was dedicated to the temple. And at one point, she had escaped from the temple. She had made it 20 miles back to her home, to her mother, over the course of 3 days. The temple mothers went and found her, threatened the mother with the wrath of the gods, saying, if you don't give her back, who knows what the gods will do to you. And they tore the little girl from her arms. When they got back, they took her hands and they branded her hands with hot irons, just as a threat, obviously, and also a mark that people would understand. And she was obviously not in a happy place. In fact, at one point, she was to be dedicated to one of the idols, and she threw herself down and prayed that she might die. But somehow she got word of a woman named Amy that was called the child-stealing mother, and it sounded like a good place for her to run. And again, I don't have the details to the story. Amy compares the story a little bit to like when Peter came out of prison, when the church was praying for him. Somehow, in the second time, she escaped, got past all the mothers, got all the way to Amy's compound, and it didn't happen all right away. She was found by an Indian Christian late at night in front of a church, who took her to Amy the next day. This little girl named Prina ran up to Amy, climbed into her lap, and began to talk and said, basically, my name is Pearl Eyes, and I want to stay here always. I've come to stay. And Amy would say, somehow an angel, a guardian angel, must have led this child from the temple, past the eyes of the temple woman, and then to me. And the timing, because of the way they were traveling, if it had happened earlier or later, it wouldn't have worked out. But the temple woman did arrive, and the child insisted she would not go back, so Amy kept them, even though there was risk there. She said, this little thing walked straight into our hearts, and we felt we'd risk anything to keep her. And then later she said, it caused a new thing to begin, and I was rooted for life. And as the child set in, Amy learned some things that were considered rumored by many people, even some missionaries, things that were awful that were happening to children like Prina, and this began a focus to help rescue children. And things started slowly, but eventually took off. In 1913, she had 130 girls and had 30 Indian volunteers. I mentioned earlier there were boys that she noticed as well. Talks about a boy who was part of a theater production. She was praying, Lord, somebody's going to do something for these little boys. It wasn't much different for them as well. And again, she said, Lord, if I can't do anything, take away this burden from me. But if so, open up a door. And God opened up a door. And in 1980, she had a home for young boys. And her heart was evangelism. And she tried to continue initially on by going with all the crowds of kids going around evangelizing. Eventually, she realized the truth of the Tamil proverb, children tie the feet of a mother, realized, I've got to set down roots. And that's where they started building in Dohnavur. And she talks about the struggle of transitioning from more reaching out to people to dealing with kids and all the stuff that it entails. She writes, if by doing some work which the undiscerning consider not spiritual work, I can best help others, and I inwardly rebel, thinking it is the spiritual for which I crave, when in truth it's the interesting and the exciting, that I know nothing of Calvary's love. All of a sudden here she was taking care of kids, and it was just busy with kids. I'm going to skip over a bunch of stuff here because we are going on here. One of the amazing things about her story is just how God provided. Her philosophy is we're not going to tell others when we're in need unless we're definitely in ask. And even if people ask us a very clear question about whether we're in need, even then we're not always going to answer. And she learned throughout her life just to rely on the Father, to tell of God the needs, and then let God supply. And she wrote a book called The Beginning of a Story, published in 1908, that just details story after story of how God had provided for the family. She wrote in that book that no appeals for money were ever made, but that God just kept on providing in such miraculous ways. And if you read the book, she talks about a time when there was a famine, food prices were rising. They needed 20 more pounds to buy rice, and 20 pounds arrived in a letter from a person completely unknown to them. She tells of another time where there was word of a child who was in danger, and they needed to have funds to go rescue that child, and they had nothing to do it. They had to send the money right away. And in that very moment, the postman walked up with a roll of rupees in his hand, a money order from Canada, which is cool enough. So, and that allowed them to deliver that child. And in that moment, they piled the money on the floor and thanked God. In times, she just felt God pushing on her. You got to keep expanding. They prayed for one time for three things. They prayed for a field near their compound to be given to them or be able to purchase for it. They prayed for money for 2 nurseries, a kindergarten, and workers' room, and they prayed for more kids in the family. Everything came, the field came very quickly. They added 17 kids very quickly, and then the money came later. She talks about serving God in such a mission during world wars. We talked about the difficulty of COVID, and that has kind of wreaked havoc on a lot of missions agencies. But imagine working through a world war. In South India in World War I, they had dozens of nurseries, lots of kids. Prices for everything was just skyrocketing during the war. And in that, all that God was pushing on her heart to be expanding. And again, she writes of just being afraid. So much great needs, so much difficulty with prices rising, and God pushing on her heart, you got to keep adding. She wrote, strength of my heart, I need not fail, not mine to fear, but to obey. With such a leader who could quail, thou art as thou wert yesterday. Strength of my heart, I rest in thee, fulfill thy purposes through me. Again, in World War II, people were writing Amy, what are you going to do to provide for your kids? And somewhere along the line, she'd read of a missionary to South Africa who had died from starvation, and she started to panic, going like, what if God doesn't provide for us and we all die of starvation, first the kids and all the workers? What glory there is for God in that. But she was calmed down, and she was reminded of that promise, or the story of the 5 loaves and 2 fishes where God provided. And she was assured of the promise that God would give them as they need and even more. And during that time, she just talks about amazing provision of God. More money was needed to be needed more money was coming in than what there was needed. The British pound was falling. The price of rice was rising. Sometimes costs were rising by 15 times what they were previously. And God just kept sending check after check after check. She writes these words, "Standing on sure ground, we can affirm just this. We have never lacked any good thing. And during the years of the war, people in the towns and villages began to say, 'God is there,' for they could not account for what they saw except by saying that." There was no explanation other than saying, God must be doing something for them. She said, "With every fresh need has come fresh supply. We have proved that it is a very safe thing to trust in the Lord our God." We're super running out of time here. But some interesting discipline stuff she would do. If kids fought, sometimes she would tie the girls' pigtails together till they worked it out. So it was a different day and time, but there's something you can try at home sometime. She had some interesting rules. When talking about people, she said, never talk about people, always to. Never about, always to. We don't talk about people, we talk to them. And then she worked very hard to create a community of love. Earlier on in her missionary career, somebody was talking to her and saying, "Oh, yeah, we don't really love each other. We work together, but you got to understand it's a tricky dynamic." And Amy worked very hard at that to create a real community and has to bite her tongue sometimes. She talked about one time she was with a group of missionaries and there was a man who was dominating in certain ways and with his words. She said, "I felt the eye in me rising hotly and quite clearly, so clearly I could show you the place on the floor of the room where I was standing when I heard it. The word came, seeing it a chance to die. To this day, that word is life and release to me, and it has been to many others. Seeing this, which seems to stir up all you wish most were not stirred up, seeing it a chance to die to self in every form." And that's the title of this book, inspired from that moment. So she worked very hard, not always successfully. And again, I recommend this book because Elizabeth Elliot, as a missionary, didn't kind of gloss over some of the difficulties that was faced, didn't explain it all, but you can see that there's a real challenge when we think of praying for missionaries. That's one thing we can be praying for is good teamwork and unity on the field. One question that came up is, was she ever married? Did she ever fall in love? It's kind of a good question. When she was younger and the family wrote a newsletter together, one of her brothers wrote this: "Our eldest sister is the light of her life. She says she'll never be a wife." This may have been some sort of commitment she made growing out of a meeting when Hudson Taylor spoke. She wrote some interesting thing about marriage. In her starry cluster, there's I forgot about the pictures because thanks for doing it. There's a picture of the starry cluster, and there's a guy with sort of pants on, and she writes about him. Husbands are so much in the way, an obstruction and a nuisance. Women need to escape them. She talks about Mariel as an amazing woman, as a woman with a soldier spirit. Instead of her, she's irresistible. Instead of her husband, he came on as a cook, being incapable of higher things, and of him, hardly a man exactly. So she would speak freely. It is interesting, though. She talks before going out on mission that she received a letter from somebody, and it was some sort of an opportunity to what she called the other life. Prayed about it and just had that sense that God was saying no. And then later on in her missionary career, another such letter that was written to her that she said of it would have opened up opportunity, all kinds of opportunity for her in many, many ways. And it would have been obviously she was probably interested in the man as well, but it would have taken her from India. And again, she just felt the Lord saying, "I have something different for you." She was careful to underline that it wasn't something better, but something different, and other people experience something different. Just very quickly, another kind of cool story is she met the Indian version of Robin Hood. There was a story in a newspaper that fascinated her, an outlaw named Raj who had all kinds of encounters with the police and really cool stories of how he would just get away from them somehow. In one story, he was handcuffed in their possession, and somehow he got away and sent the handcuffs back to the police so they could use them again on somebody else. He was kind to the children, kind to old people and the poor. And Amy thought to herself, one thing she often prayed for is, like, where are the men? the Lord sent me the men. She needed men for the work with the boys and all sorts of things. And Amy wondered what such a man might do for the kingdom of God if he turned his energies the right way. And so she tried to arrange a meeting with this Raj, and people said there's no way it could ever happen, but she prayed about it. And one day as she was looking at some fields they were considering purchasing for the mission, 3 armed men jumped out from rocks, and she saw them come out and said, "Hey, I've got tea and bread here," and they had a picnic and a conversation. She talked with his men, and it's a long story, but long story short, this man came to faith, and his wife had passed away. He asked Amy to care for his children. And later on, he was caught again. She witnessed to him. He was baptized. And then later, he escaped. One thing she prayed for him is she was encouraged by the police to try and bring him in, and she visited with him while he was on the lam. And she said to him, you need to give yourself up. He said, if I give myself up, they'll kill me. He said, well, if only I heard that you would die without a weapon in your hand, that would be enough for me. And the story goes, as he was captured, he stood on the high bank. He swung his gun in the air 3 times, threw it away, tore off his shirt, and pointed at people where to shoot. And he was later killed for that. I am going to skip this. One thing I wanted to cover very quickly is earlier on in her missions career when things were better, she wrote these words as a prayer: Lord, teach me how to conquer pain. When my day's work is done on earth, take me straight home. Do not let me be ill and a burden or anxiety to anyone. Let me not die of a lingering illness. Father, forgive me if this prayer is wrong. And you may be familiar with the story where she was checking out a property in a village, and she fell into a hole for a latrine that was built in the wrong spot. Fell in, broke her ankle and her leg, or twisted her ankle and her leg. And it didn't seem like it was a serious thing, but the long story short is she was in bed basically for the last 20 years of her ministry. Difficult thing for her to accept, and there's a lot of interesting stories in that time, but one of the things that really happened in those years is she started spending the time she needed to write. Her commitment was always, all right when I have nothing better to do. She was busy. Now things had changed a little bit, and she wrote a number of books, of which we have a few copies. Some of them are no longer in print. And maybe, you know what, what we'll do is we'll finish the story. I'll put on the video. It's hard to measure what is the legacy of her work. Today, Dawn of Her Fellowship still exists. What was 140 acres is now 400 acres. The ministry has changed quite a bit. Partly, in a large part because of Amy, temple prostitution was outlawed in 1948. Now they're receiving kids. It's a different kind of reason. It's poverty, or it's people who prefer to have a boy because of, like in other places of the world where it's economically better to have a boy. Today they have a hospital that began under Amy's ministry. One of the doctors was a child taken in as a baby. They still have children there. They have a boarding school there, which allows 13 different mission agencies to have their children cared for by the school while their parents evangelize all over India. Abandoned children are still taken in, and just an amazing ministry. She cared for thousands of children, literally. And what's interesting to consider is these were real children. I know some of these photos, because you watch the old black and white photos, and it feels like so long ago. But Prina was just a little 7-year-old girl rescued from the temple. And thousands of kids were rescued from very difficult circumstances. She wrote these words: when I consider the cross of Christ, how can anything that I do be called sacrifice? And then she also wrote, he said, love as I love you, we cannot love too much. So maybe we'll leave it there. What I would encourage you to do is if you're younger and you want to read the story, this has a lot of information. This is from the church library, so you can take it from here and just bring it back. If you're interested in a bigger book, I can loan you this copy. And I'd encourage you, actually, there's a lot of other amazing missionary stories downstairs in the library. I'd encourage you in that. But maybe we can just cue up the video and run this. This will give you a bit of an idea of what Dawn of Her looks like. You'll get to the buildings at about 45 seconds, and you can kind of get a picture of the thing. But maybe I'll just pray, and then those who are some of you are already home, so you can just keep watching, but those who need to leave, you can feel free to go. Lord, I want to thank you for your grace, and I want to thank you for the amazing ways you can use a life. As Amy looked at herself, she didn't see much, but thank you for the things you've accomplished through her and for her example. And Lord, our prayer for our own selves tonight is just, would you help us to become more like Jesus? Would you help us to have courage and strength and tenacity? Would you just use our lives in ways that would glorify you, not necessarily the same way, but in different ways. And we just pray these things for the sake of your good name. Amen. So thanks for coming. If you want to throw the video up, that would be great. And you can see some of the pictures of the buildings and such. Thanks for coming.
This video is made possible in part by Zondervan and their new book, Know How We Got Our Bible, by Ryan Reeves and Charles Hill. This is the newest volume in the excellent Know series, edited by Justin Holcomb, and I'll tell you more about it in just a moment. We've just arrived at Dohnavur Fellowship here in the far south of India. This is the place Amy Carmichael brought into existence through prayer, you could say. She served here for many years, she died here, and she's left behind this incredible legacy. I'm so excited to go and explore it.
For guests.
Okay, right. And then on the property, there are still children living here?
But now there's a lot of restriction because until 2002, we were able to take children from babies, even one-day baby, two-day babies we were taking. But now, from 2002, government restricted that allowed us to take children only from the age of 5.
Oh, okay.
So then, until then, we were taking children from all over India. And in different parts of the world, we are able to shine as witnesses for Christ.
So all of this she saw, all of this was built under her. Yes. Okay.
Actually, most of the construction in DF was over by 1950s.
Okay.
All these buildings.
Okay. She died in, is it 1951? Right,
Yes.
okay. And when did she first settle here?
Actually, she came to this village in 1900 June.
1902?
Yeah, 1900.
Oh, 1900, okay.
1900.
These are the living quarters where she stayed for many, many years. Many of her personal effects are still here. Her library is still here, and I believe largely intact. It's interesting to go through. She was a voracious reader and read across many, many topics. Of note, there's lots of commentaries, lots of Bible works, and then there's also quite a lot of biographies. She seemed to enjoy reading biographies of many of the great missionaries. Coming around, there's this painting here of the Matterhorn, and apparently she especially appreciated a metaphor related to mountains, which is sometimes life's trials seem too difficult to endure, and yet just as somebody eventually prevailed and climbed the mountain, so we too can endure and overcome through Christ's help the trials we endure. She spent her later years bedridden, and you can actually see a mark on the ground there where the post of the cot was. But above her bed then, she had these promises that were very precious to her. She would meditate on them, pray and claim those promises to sustain her through very, very difficult days.
When I came here 8 days, baby, Hamas child.
Oh, really?
I was born in 1948.
1948. Okay.
Amma died in 1951.
51, right, so 3 years old.
Amma gave me the name.
Oh, really? She gave you your name?
Flower.
Oh, okay.
That's cool.
Actually, 1924, Amma started to build.
Oh, really?
Architect, everything from Kerala.
Okay, so Amy built this, or Amy oversaw this being built? Wow. She was an ambitious person. Wonderful. Beautiful.
Easter Sunday morning,
Yes.
whole family will come here.
Oh, okay.
And she called Amma, Prina.
Prina, right. Right.
You know the story about Prina?
I know the story of Prina, yeah.
She called Amma.
Okay.
So Amma likes to call her children Amma.
Okay. Amma is mom, right? Mummy?
Mother.
Mother, yeah, right. So if we go around here and we see a child, they'll be saying Amma to their mother? Okay.
Amma is Kerala word. Amma is Tamil word.
Okay. And it's very similar in almost every language has ma, mom, mother, yeah. Every language has the same word. Because it's the first one babies can make, right?
Yeah,
And mama.
mama.
Yeah. It was her wish that she be buried in an unmarked grave. She'd be buried even without a coffin. They did not put her in a coffin, but they did choose to mark the grave with a simple bird bath. She had a great love for nature, a great love for animals, for birds. So they put a bird bath here with her name and the date of her death on it. And every day they come out and they put water in it to ensure the birds can still enjoy this spot.